Hi, my name is Matthew Lee. I'm actually originally from the States, but I've been in Brisbane for the year, which I guess is enough to get me qualified as a local speaker on the program. I am also my Twitter handle is AlfheimWander, which makes me the A in AFK Studios. And today's presentation is going to be on Beyond Flow, the importance of coherence in long-term engagement. Out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with some of the psychology of game design? Ah, fair number of you. How many of you are game designers? Cool. People studying games? Okay. Fair, nice even split there. Anyone in any of the other disciplines of games? Wow. Front row, very nice. Thank you. Well, as I said, my name is Matthew Lee. I'm creative director of AFK Studios. I'm also the chair of the IGD series Game SIG and a Fulbright Scholar in Psychology, which is what has brought me over to Australia, this wonderful, wonderful country where everything is trying to kill me but hasn't quite succeeded yet, for a year. I'm specifically studying things like game psychology and what makes games tick, and that's been a rather interesting excursion so far. As a member of the IGDA, though, I would be remiss if I did not point out our webinar happening next week on exploring worlds of thought and play, how games help us explore literature, mental health, and more, with speakers from the games Nevermind, which have you explore the world of mental health patients and try to fix issues within their minds, and Elsinore, which is a take on Shakespeare's Hamlet, with you from the point of view of Ophelia with time looping mechanics. You're going through, you're trying to prevent everyone from dying, including yourself. So it's a fun little challenge. You might or might not succeed. I mean, it's a tragedy after all. But it's a cool little thing. It's a webinar, online, free. You can find out more about it. And yeah, it's going to be a good time. But on to the meat of the presentation then. I'm sure you've all heard about the magic circle, Johann Hitzinger, how play happens in this consecrated space, this other world, with rules set apart from those of the world we know. We know now that even though these worlds are a subset of the world we know, they're not completely separate, which is why you can take psychology and apply it to design. I mean, we've created a number of frameworks as designers in order to help ourselves better the work we do, help us make sense of things, communicate with our teams, understand the audience we work with, and a few of those today are the MDA framework and PENS, which I'll go into shortly. The MDA framework, as you know, splits things up to mechanics, dynamic aesthetics, with mechanics being closer to the base things that components of the game, dynamics being the ones that are generated by the interactions of mechanics, aesthetics generated by the interactions of aesthetics, and aesthetics being the things that are closest to the end user experience, of course. But of course, a lot of this also ties into intrinsic motivation and all the things that make sense from the user experience point of view, the motivation they have to do what they do, to continue participating in a game. Like, does a game give them a sense of competence? Do the mechanics promote that? Does it make them feel like they have power to do what they want to do? Does it give them a meaningful sense of progression? Does it let them feel like it supports their sense of autonomy, that their choices matter, that they have the power to choose different things, or are they forced into doing one certain set of things that may not be the most fun? Does it promote relatedness? Do you care about it? Does it make you feel for any of the NPCs, the story, or such like that? These are the three psychological needs that are the core components of motivation. Intrinsic motivation, as opposed to motivation through something else, like, say, for money or such. This here is the entire spectrum of motivation, from someone who is completely self-determined, who is doing something because they are motivated to do it because it's something they want to do, it's internal, they enjoy it, they're interested in it, as opposed to someone who has no motivation at all on the other end. Like maybe you're being forced to do it because you're here for a class, or you have to do it because if you don't, you will fail, you suffer dire consequences. Moving on a little, maybe you get some sort of other reward for doing something. Maybe you're being paid for a study, or maybe you start to enjoy things. But generally, we want people to go towards the green side of the spectrum than the black side of the spectrum. And we've come to see that, and we've come to apply this to games as well as to the rest of the human experience in what we call PENS, player experience of need satisfaction. It's a framework based on the self-determination theory, which includes intrinsic motivation, and basically specifies that long-term player engagement can be measured by a game's ability to satisfy these three needs in the long term. In fact, we found that more than a measure of fun, more than what people report as something they enjoy in the short term, after about 12 months or so, people are more inclined to recommend a game or stick with the game from a developer if they found it actually met their needs. They met with their autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we found then that game design, in terms of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, involves a lot of these things, a lot of the player psychology, understanding all this, how flow, progression, engagement, enjoyment, expectations, all this stuff feeds together. And as game designers, it's very common for us to want to create experiences, individual games that generate flow, that really draw people into what they're doing, that really make them feel engaged, that make them have fun, that make them lose track of time. Flow is one of the really big things about game design that makes it so magical and cool. But the thing is, flow only works for segments and individual titles. You don't have flow across titles necessarily because, well, by that time, they've already finished their game. You've maybe had a year, 2 years, 3 years, and now they're looking at the next one. So you can't create that. What you can do, though, in moving on beyond flow, is create something called coherence, which is something that, that game company does really well with some of their stuff with flow error. So, positive psychology. How many of you are familiar with it? A few, I see. Most of psychology you may have heard of is the psychology that focuses on different aspects of mental illness or how we relate to one another and such, but positive psychology relates to growth, human experience, how we grow and how we thrive. It asks some interesting questions about what makes things engaging. Like, why do we want to do what we want to do? Like, what have we accomplished? What do different emotions evoke in us? How do experiences evoke emotions in us? And how does this affect us? Positive psychology is also called PERMA and is defined by these 5 different principles. Positive emotion, which is referenced by a number of different theories. The self-determination theory, which I've talked about, Salutogenesis, which is the study of how we remain healthy even while we're really, really stressed out. Because some people, as you know, respond to stress pretty well. We stay healthy, we keep ourselves grounded, we don't get sick. Other people, you give them too much stress, especially when something they don't want to do and don't find any meaning in, they crash. It's pretty easy to do that, and I'll go into why later. Learned optimism as opposed to learned helplessness. You get engagement. One of the big things what we do as game designers, flow, playing to people's strengths, thinking about mindfulness and reflection, which you try to incorporate but don't always have time to depending on the medium you're designing for. Mobile games don't have that much time for reflection often enough. Got relationships, communities. A lot of that stuff is what I work with. Okay. Of course, we have finding meaning and people's accomplishments. All right, so Salutogenesis. We talk about how people overcome challenges, adapt to stressful situations. Bless you. It's composed of its main component is the sense of coherence. The global orientation determines whether or not something will be harmful. This is composed of 3 main components, which I liken to the Triforce. You have comprehensibility, which is, do you understand everything that's going on in a certain experience? Or that happens because of a certain stressor? Like, do you understand what's going on about it? Can you meaningfully predict what's going to happen because of that? Like, in that one is closest like Zelda. Do you have the wisdom to understand what's going on? Manageability. Do you have the power and resources to deal with it? Like, do you have Ganon's sheer magical might to just like blast through obstacles? And is it meaningful to you? Do you have a sense of motivation? Are you Link? Are you able to deal with it, no matter what comes your way? If you have all three of these, it's like you have the entire Triforce. You have a coherent experience that really builds on itself and allows people to stay even if it's challenging to them. The most important part of this, of course, is meaningfulness, because if you don't have a reason to want to do something or want to understand and accomplish something, you're not going to bother. And if if any one of these is missing, it's really easy for people to just lose interest, go away, or just in human experience fall sick. This can really be applied to game design. Because we talk about flow and Newtonian engagement. We talk about how people are engaged with a game or remain engaged until acted on by an outside force. I mean, the obvious example for Newton stuff is the Newton's cradle. The little desktop toy you play with where you pull back on the ball, let it hit the other ball, and it keeps going clacking back and forth and back and forth. But the thing is that even these things aren't perpetual motion machines. Eventually they'll come to a halt because you lose some momentum every time things clack back and forth. You get waste energy and dissipation. Similarly, even though we think about people losing interest in a game happening from outside forces, like, oh, maybe you're hungry or tired after a long play session. Maybe you get environmental distractions. It's gotten dark. You can no longer see the screen. People are shouting at you to come down for dinner or something like that. This is only concerned about manageability, and it doesn't take into account that every time you do something, every time you're exposed to something, you might lose a bit of interest, a bit of coherence, because games themselves can also decrease engagement, even or especially if you don't change things around. This happens because of the loss of coherence, because of violation of comprehensibility and meaningfulness. Like, if you change around the mechanics and dynamics of a game that's from its predecessor quite a bit without justifying why, making a really different experience, that can be troublesome to people. So, a few examples of this are Age of Empires 3. How many of you have played that game? How many of you played the prequels to that, Age of Empires 2 and such? Okay. Any reason why some of you played 2 but not 3? Anything?
Too different.
Yeah, too different. One of the things I was introduced in the 3, for example, was the home city, where you would go in, where instead of just doing the standard research tactics and creating your soldiers, as you leveled up to age, you could also like request different shipments, level up the home city, so it had this whole different element to it. And people were like, wait, this isn't an Age of Empires game. It doesn't feel like an Age of Empires game. And that feeling is one of the things that really annoyed people. The same thing was true of Age of Empires Online, where you had to either grind or pay to unlock the different civilizations. And people were like, hey, this really isn't an Age of Empires game. What's going on here? Because in RTS, you generally start out with all the available civilizations open to you, and you just had to tech up within each individual game. You didn't carry on the progressions of your home cities and such between games. That just wasn't a thing that happened. Another example might be Star Wars: The Old Republic. Any of you play that? Okay. But I'm sure many more of you are familiar with the Star Wars franchise, yes? Yes. Well, in the Star Wars franchise, I'm sure you're all aware, Jedi are pretty much badasses. They can use the Force, they can jump around, they have lightsabers, they can cut through almost anything. It's really cool stuff. And so you expect when you jump into the experience of playing a Jedi Knight that you're going to be able to do all sorts of these similar things, or at least what you've been able to do in some of the prior games like KOTOR, Knights of the Old Republic. Like, say, deflect blaster bolts and use cool powers. But as it turns out, when you start off as a Jedi Knight, it's not very fun at all. You get this basic training lightsaber that's like a long glow stick that does very tiny amounts of damage, and in a game where most things attack you from range, you have to try to run up to them. It's not very fun. You have more fun playing as some of the other characters because they don't defy your expectations so negatively. And that's one way that you can lose comprehensibility, because you predict the Jedi would be powerful, and it's not. Third example, the Hinterlands of Dragon Age Inquisition. How many of you have played Inquisition? Did any of you have issues with the Hinterlands? Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that BioWare's BioWare has encouraged in all of its previous games is for you to go into a hub, finish everything in the hub before moving on, because otherwise you could miss out on side missions, miss out on opportunities. It's been like that in a lot of the Mass Effect games and the other previous Dragon Age games and such. You want to complete everything before you continue, but not in Inquisition. In Inquisition, especially with the Hinterlands, you go there, you hit it up, you're expected to only do a few things and then quickly move on, because Hinterlands is one of the weaker areas in the game. And the whole thing starts to feel like an MMO grind if you just continue in the Hinterlands until you can no longer go. In fact, one of the main designers has actually put out a plea to say, please, get out of the Hinterlands as soon as possible, which is probably good advice to follow in that regard. It's very different from what BioWare has set up in as expectations for previous games, though, and so that's something you have to be cautious about. Because if you've set up that sort of system for people to go through a game in a certain pattern, and then you're changing up the pattern abruptly without some way to introduce them to a new way of doing things, people are going to get very frustrated, especially if they're still operating under the old assumptions and not having a lot of fun because of it. This has to do with comprehensibility and then you have comprehensibility in the player-developer communication gap. Both sides operating with very incomplete information. Like, as designers and developers, we're aware of what goes on in our teams. We're aware of how difficult game development is. We're aware of the day-to-day challenges of what goes on. All the nitty-gritty that gets put into every single feature, every single character, every single design decision. But players don't know this. A lot of players don't have any idea how difficult it is to make a game, and they make this pretty obvious on their forum posts, among other things. Versus, as developers, we sometimes lack the player perspective, and we've become so invested in our work that it becomes difficult to understand why are players attacking us, criticizing us so much, especially towards the end. And when you get these missing information filled up by assumptions, you get that whole wonderful thing called the fundamental attribution error, where you think that when people are criticizing you, it's because they don't understand what's going on. They must be nasty, nasty people. It's not that you don't see their circumstances. An example of this, let's say it's a very rainy day. The roads are very slippery. You're walking down a hillside. You try to be very careful. If you're very carefully going down the hill, you don't manage to trip, or even if you do slip, you're like, whoa, I had to be careful. The roads are slippery. Whereas if you're watching someone else walk down and you're just sitting at the bus stop, not realizing how treacherous and slippery the roads are, you see someone fall down, you think, man, that guy is clumsy. Okay. Similar example here. So you get people thinking that maybe developers are bad, maybe developers don't put any effort into this, when the truth is it's really hard to make a game, even if it's a bad game. And when player concerns, when all the players making the forum posts think they're being ignored by the one voice of the designer, they often start to resent this because they feel they're being disenfranchised, that you're taking money from them and yet you're changing their experience, you're offering them something they didn't ask for. this is especially the case when advertising and promotional materials are very different from the final product. When your demos, your trailers, and such promise an experience that's not entirely there in the final game. Like, as developers and designers, when we create these things, and when marketing create these things, we know that this is more of a, here's what we're shooting for, this is the world we'd like to give you, these are some of the things we want to show you. So hey, come, play our games, this will be what there is. Players often take these as absolute promises of, oh, this is what is absolutely going to be what's in the game, and there's probably more because you can't show us all the cool stuff, right? Very, very different. This causes problems. For example, No Man's Sky. Yeah, a great example of how playing up expectations and then not quite meeting them can cause a lot of problems for people. Sure, in the first month you had a lot of players, but it suffered one of the most drastic fall-offs in players of any game, really. Multiplayer wasn't there, and then you get people hanging in the forums, often showcasing ignorance, like, sure, you could put this in 1 week, right? That any of you who have done multiplayer or worked on big game systems know how difficult it is to put in a major change to a game. It's like, no, this is not a week. This is really not, but they don't get that. Pokémon GO, another big one. I don't know how many of you saw the original trailer for Pokémon GO? None of you? A few of you. Good. So you saw how in the trailer they actually showed off real-time tracking as you were getting close to things, being able to battle anywhere, capture these different points, these sorts of raid battles. Almost none of this is in the game. And so people are like, no, it's been a month, plus it seems like Niantic has not been very good at the community management sort of thing, hasn't been very communicative, so players have become unhappy and moved on, especially as there's not that much prospect for change. And then Assassin's Creed Unity, another great example of how expectations were really let down. But that's easy to do in some of the big franchises, especially when you're setting up such an ambitious development cycle and making a few perhaps mistakes in PR and communication along the way, dealing with how difficult things are to animate or bugginess or such as that. Then you get meaningfulness and coherence. The belief that something's actually interesting and source of satisfaction. That's something that will give you an answer to, why am I doing this? Like, why am I playing this game when I have so many other options? Why am I investing my time in this activity in the game? Why am I talking to these people? Why am I buying products from this one company? And because that's what motivates people to persist in these challenges, to persist in overcoming the obstacles of change dynamics or increased difficulty or all sorts of other things that come their way. It's basically a kind of trust or faith. And when people's faith is seemingly betrayed, it's not a good thing. Meaningfulness is why consumers take leaps of faith on your next product, on whether it's a new franchise or another franchise. It's that promise of a good experience, the hype, the loyalty, the comments of friends, which is still big, whether online or off, whether or not they have friends who will be playing with them, because game experiences are often more fun when you have people to talk about them with. And then what trusted influencers have to say. What do Let's Players like it? What does the game press have to say about reviewers? You jump and you hope there's something at the bottom. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes you get franchise fatigue and there's a loss of meaningfulness. When you get things like troubled launches, marketing missteps, loss of community engagement, and failure to innovate, or even perceived failure to innovate, you lose that sense of coherence and people just disengage. These are just a number of the things that can happen or that number of the things that can cause it. There are certainly more, but a comprehensive list would be a little difficult to put down. I mean, a lot of the companies know about things like this. Like, the leader for Ubisoft North America knew that if you release something that wasn't quite up to spec, it damages the brand, that people would change their mind about it and they won't want it anymore. Unfortunately, for some reason, Assassin's Creed Unity shipped anyway, so that turned out to be prophetic, and it did damage the brand because a lot fewer people played Syndicate than would have played if it hadn't happened. Largely, this is quite a bit of a matter of perspective because even in a lot of the installments that follow these supposedly bad games can still be enjoyable, can still be well designed. And a lot of these games can still be good when taken as independent standalone games. Like even Unity, okay, once you get past a lot of that, still decent. But the problem is, once you've set up all these expectations, once you've set up the expectation that it's going to be good, set up the promise, set up the comprehensibility from the previous titles, people can get tired of it because it's not up to their expectations. Expectations shape our reality, unfortunately or unfortunately. But the problem is, how do you convince people to give you a chance in the sea of negativity, like after disenchanted fans are maligning a series without playing the new titles, when your past mistakes have hurt reputation or leading to inferences about motives? I mean, a very common one is people saying that EA or Ubisoft are money grubbing or just after to take your money and offering poor experiences based on it, or you have gaffes in communication, like I'm sure the women are too hard to animate meme that came out with Unity. That perfect storm kind of destroyed that title a little bit. How do you resolve all this? A lot of that, it's communication. It's about being able to work with your community, to talk with your fans, to talk with the people who are playing and investing. If you don't have that sense of transparency, if you don't have some reason to explain why you're doing what you're doing, why you're changing things around, and giving some sort of answer that not only makes sense from your perspective, but from their perspective, taking into account what it is that they expect, what they see, and what they know, they're going to think it's an excuse. And people don't generally like excuses all that much, because especially when they think you can do better, which is especially the case when you're a large company. If you're a large company, you're making millions and millions of dollars, like Ubisoft, EA, etc. A lot of the stuff I talked about also applies, unfortunately or fortunately, to serious games, which is a genre that I'm sure a few of you are familiar with. It's games that are supposedly designed to do more than just entertainment, games that are used for health purposes, for learning, training, or all sorts of other things, for health, therapy, you name it. But a lot of serious games pretty much hit every single button of what not to do. They overpromise. They say, we are going to be the best thing ever for this type of thing. We're going to treat depression. We're going to do it better than anyone else. We're going to make it more engaging than any of these other sorts of therapies. And yet these games often ignore conventions. They ignore what it is to be a game. They're often made by people who are very early designers or clients who ignore the design perspective, and so create things that are monstrosities, things that are unplayable, things that are bloated, things that don't do what they set out to do. Plus, the fact that here you have an additional wrinkle in the hay, where you have an additional client that's making all the decisions, and they're paying for the game, where you're not charging players for it, means you don't really take into account the player expectations that much, which can be very problematic when the players your intended players are your final audience. Great example of this is SPARX. Have any of you heard of this game? Right. One of the more famous serious games, it came out a few years ago, was marketed as the video game for depression, made in good old New Zealand, actually, University of Auckland. First came out in 2009, meant to help teens and adolescents between, say, 13 and 19 deal with depression and anxiety without the stigma that you would normally have from going in to see a clinician. Minor problem. In the original clinical trial for this, where they would show that, yes, it could treat depression about as well as standard therapy, the audience was not people who refused to seek help. The audience was people who had already been going to a clinic to seek help, so not really working with your outreach factor there, not really designing for engagement. And so when they licensed it for distribution, making this short, basically 3.5-hour experience available for $30 USD a month, yeah, no one bought that. The company which licensed it kind of went bankrupt and has flopped since then. I would refer you to the very terrible port that came out on the Android App Store, but that has since been taken down. Probably for the better. I mean, some of the more successful games for good don't call themselves serious games. They're audience-focused. They sell like commercial games. They are commercial games most of the time. They innovate and integrate narrative and gameplay. They focus on communities, creating memorable experiences. Life is Strange, for example, just won the Game of the Year at Games for Change this year. And there are quite a few other games that follow on in that vein. They focus on being games before striving to be games for good, which is a core concept that most people forget. When you hear that something is supposed to be a game, you have clear expectations that a game is supposed to be fun, a game is supposed to be engaging. Serious games often forget about that. And that's probably the worst violation of coherence in like everything I've seen. Other examples of good serious games, Folded is pretty much like the one everyone cites in any serious game presentation. It's about turning protein folding into a puzzle, competing against other people to fold the proteins more efficiently. And you've gotten some good results out of that, like making proteins that are, say, 28 times more efficient than would be manufactured by a computer algorithm, solving the folding sequences for how a virus that's very similar to the HIV virus connects to and infects cells with and such. You have this War of Mine, which really powerfully captures the experience of what it's like to be a civilian in a war zone, which almost no other game has. You get Never Alone, which integrates cultural stories into a different format, and Elsinore, which is the aforementioned Shakespeare with time-looping mechanics game. Great way of exploring different things, as long as you make it fun, manage to harness the power of games and not that dreaded term gamification where you take the veneer of what makes games and thinks that's the core. Or, of course, you have things like Project Discovery, which is a nice collaboration between EVE Online and the MMO Science together with the Human Protein Atlas, integrating some of the citizen science mechanics into the experience in EVE Online. In this project, you have players analyzing and sorting out cellular material as a way of, say, reverse engineering alien technology to let you use it, which is a nice, coherent way to fit it all into the storyline. It's something that a lot of serious games in particular could learn from, or a way that a lot of commercial games could use to integrate more serious themes or more ventures for good into what they're already doing as a way of getting more outreach and exploring new areas. So, coherence and context. First, let's think about a few things. Coherence is subjective. Coherence is an experience that differs per person. What makes something coherent for one person is not going to be the same for the next. It's your level of skill, your experience with different games, the things you care about the most, these change person to person. Even how you're feeling day to day or moment by moment can affect that a bit. Coherence is a moving target. It changes over time, depending on what has come out recently, what the genres are evolving to become, what the monetization model is, and your reputation as a developer, and it will continue to shift. It's never static, just like the industry is never static. A great game from 10 years ago is probably not going to be rated as necessarily a great game today, because games age quite a bit. And coherence only makes sense in context. If you think about games not as a standalone unit, but as part of a larger system with players and player communities. No game's an island to itself. You have to understand how coherence, how these moving systems and moving parts stay coherent or not. And that brings me to salutogenic design, or how you promote all this cross-title coherence, how you balance the need for innovation, for new things in different titles, with player expectations that you've built up in the past ones, with consistency, making these integrated, coherent experiences. It's important that you have these games that these games are not perceived as formula-driven. You may have a basic formula for what you want to do that you then iterate on, but if people become attached to the idea that this is all you do, you follow on this one formula and you keep executing on this one example and you're milking it to death, it doesn't matter how innovative you can be. People's perception of that will ultimately override the truth, unfortunately. I mean, that's not to say you should not preserve core elements in your design, narrative style, and such, because you should. These are things that make your games your games. You change those around too much, like, for example, in the Dragon Age series, people get a little confused with like what's going on. Or you change around the Age of Empires series too much, and people are like, this isn't Age of Empires anymore. It still has to feel like it still has to feel like the genre or the type of game they're used to, without being overly repetitive and reusing everything from the past generation. Difficult balance to strike, but it's something to look towards. And salutogenic design, it works with players and player the communities. You get transparency, you acknowledge their concerns, you talk to them, you try not to overreach, and you facilitate transitions between titles, explaining why some things are different in advance, so they're not completely taken by surprise when it's not necessary. That's not to say there aren't challenges from the developer side. I mean, understanding the legacy of a long-running franchise especially the ones with huge teams, can be difficult, really difficult. I mean, the more people there are working on a team, the more miscommunications can happen, the more chances there are for something to get lost. The longer a franchise has been running, the more different teams that have worked on something, the easier it is for something to get lost. There could be plenty of promises people made, plenty of things said to the community that are not taken into account in later games because maybe the person working on one game left, and so the design, the leadership and vision changed somewhere through the creation process. That's why you need to be familiar with the previous games, the play styles, and any ends left dangling so you don't just continue to have unfinished ends, unfinished business. Otherwise, that seems sloppy to players. But yeah, you also have to remember the fan is derived from the word fanatic. So you're probably going to see a lot of angry people over things that they don't like, unfortunately. And if you offer them explanations based on what you know and your context without taking into account what they know and what they expect, people are probably going to blow up because they'll take it as excuses. Other challenges. Remember the audience you're addressing. Remember the medium you're designing for. If giving an interview or a press comment that is not going to be video but is transcripted, if people don't watch the video and don't see you doing what you're doing, they might very well not get your intent. Sarcasm, things like sarcasm or humor don't necessarily always make it to the written word. I mean, that's why we have smileys on the internet today and emojis. And of course, self-care. I mean, if you're concentrated on this tiny little step that's in front of you and you're close to burning out, you won't care about the big picture. It's really hard when you can't even take care of yourself. It's hard to have empathy for someone else when you're going through a really rough time, especially during crunch time. And that is not a fun thing. So key points to consider again. Context is key. People, both people in your team and the legacy that has been left behind, as well as the people you're designing for, your audience and the expectations you've cultivated in them are important. Flow is great for short-term engagement, for individual games. It should be a goal to aim for when possible. But it's not enough in the long term. It's not enough to keep people coming back time after time after time, especially as their expectations change. Formula can be good, but don't depend on them. Recognize that sometimes they will have to change and adapt. And if people catch you using a formula, well, the audience is generally less forgiving than other game developers. And coherence, that's a journey, not a destination. You constantly have to keep working at it. It's not enough to achieve a sense of coherence between a couple of games and think, okay, this is good enough, we can stick with this approach. You have to keep looking at what keeps an experience coherent and modify that as necessary. Because at the end of the day, it's a journey, not a destination. You have to keep striving, keep exploring, keep wandering. Because really, with the magic circle, the magic circle's boundary is porous. People take in their expectations and beliefs from previous games, from other expectations, and bring that to the game. Unfortunately, you cannot have every experience be fresh. You cannot have every experience be unmarred by what people have experienced before. And so because they take these behavioral assumptions and attitudes with them, you have to understand that and design accordingly. In the end, everything changes. Avatars, places, styles, but the heart remains. People are people. And people can be really tough to design things and make things for, but still gotta try. Like it or not, that's the industry we're in. Thanks. Questions? Yes.
How would you balance the changes in your game? Because you want to change some of the things and keep some of the flow, right?
Yeah.
But there are games that even when you change everything, like for example Zelda, you keep having a good game. So I don't know if it's true for every game. Or...
This is more for this is more aimed at if you're doing franchises, for example, if you're trying to keep that consistent flavor, and you're doing sequels based on a game. But if you are, you can change everything. I mean, in some ways, it depends on what people are expecting of you. If you've just come out with one game, you can change a lot. You can change a lot of things for the next one, as long as you don't make it necessarily based on the first one, or you don't have a pattern of having a long-running pattern of creating things that set up certain expectations. Like BioWare setting up all sorts of these expectations to do the hub clear, and then wait, I have to do only a few missions and move on is an example of, wait, what are you doing here? Because they've already set up that pattern over countless games. If you're doing it over a much smaller sample, you have the chance to set expectations differently. Any other questions? Questions, comments, concerns, feedback? Yes. Over there first. Yeah? Mm-hmm. That can be difficult. Very difficult. What type of online game? Like MMO, MOBA, or like a brawler? Make sure that whatever you're adding fits with the context of what people have come to expect. Make sure things are tested before you go for it, which can be really hard sometimes, with how hard it is to certify patches and do great updates. In the end, it's really making sure that it works as intended, that it isn't. That if you're updating an online game, it's a little different from working with from iterated title, because it's a game that's alive. It's a game that people will continue to play. Make sure that as you're updating the game, if it changes their core experience, be a little wary of that, and make sure you understand and explain why it is that's happening. If it's a game where it's a brawler and you might change the meta around, people expect that to happen anyway, so as long as the character isn't way too overpowered, so it looks like you're trying to sell things to them and negate the advantages of everything else, that's fine too. Just make sure everything's in line with what they've come to expect. I noticed another question from you.
Sorry, I was just wondering whether the concept of coherence also applies to things like spiritual successor of games, where it's not sequel of the game that take elements of the game and try to apply it.
But to a degree, yes. Spiritual successors do like to capture the feel of the game, if nothing else, no? So you have to be, yeah, that's the player's expectations. If you call something a spiritual successor, that it captures the feel, match that. You don't necessarily have to capture all the mechanics, but it's that feel you go for. Understand the expectations and design accordingly, essentially. That's not to say your vision isn't important or what you want to do, but just keep a touch on the pulse and what people are talking about. Just like it's important to keep touch with your team, it's important to understand the community you're creating for. Any others? Yes, in the back.
When a series is making a big change,
Yes.
what do you think are better ways companies can do to manage that? Do you think it's just a matter of communicating and being clear with that that's the intent?
Yeah, I think communicating and being clear that that's the intent would help. Certainly making people understand or show why it is that they're doing that. Showcasing maybe what makes part of it cool or build it into the experience early on through maybe some of the marketing or some of the other things that come up before release, rather than surprise people with it. Because if people are hit with a nasty surprise or just something they really don't expect, they form their own judgment, versus if you can help shape some of their expectations earlier on, like a lot of companies already do anyway with all the marketing material, that could be a way to help get around that. Yes?
Yeah, so how could you combat fatigue? Like, say you are working on the 50th Assassin's Creed. Like, how can you still make an engaging game that has been around that long? Or even like fatigue on genre or theme or something like that? How can you still hit people's, like achieve expectations and get people engaged with something with their fatigue potential?
It's possible. It's also very difficult if it's a fan that's become disenchanted. It's easier if they have a little bit of a gap, like if maybe they stopped playing around Assassin's Creed 4 and they've come back around Syndicate. It's like if they skip a generation or so, it's a lot easier to see the changes and the innovations that have taken place. It feels a lot more fresh as opposed to the same thing over and over. Because when you annualize a game, that's one of the big dangers and one of the things that can lead into fatigue. Because there's not only that perception of a game not having time to innovate, but the innovations that do happen tend to be fairly small in between those games. So people are like, it's the same thing over and over, and they burn out. Spacing things out a little more, even though it might not lead to the huge amounts of profit year after year, help, because it gives the impression that there's more time in development. You probably can spend more time bug fixing if you absolutely need to. And it allows more time for you to show innovation, for you to show off different changes and changes for good reason. People have more expectations of you in that regard when you're a much bigger company with all these resources. So these things have to be evident and not just the same formula over and over again. They basically make the innovation a little more obvious and extend the time frame so it doesn't look like you're selling them the same thing over and over for more money.
Sure.
Anything else? No? Thank you.